In 1965, the first combat units of the U.S. Army landed in southern Vietnam. With this move, the Americans raised the bar of their war in Vietnam. U.S. soldiers directly participate in the conflict. Modern means of war and weapons of mass destruction were mobilized in an attempt to save the U.S.-backed puppet regime from ultimate collapse. U.S. troops continuously conducted search and destroy operations. They aim at forests, villages, and innocent civilians in southern Vietnam using weapons of destruction banned by international conventions in their massacres. More dangerously, the U.S. Army had orchestrated the largest campaign of chemical warfare in the history of mankind, both in terms of scale and nature in Vietnam. In early 1961, U.S. President Kennedy and the National Security Council gave the green light to chemical warfare in an inoffensive name, Operation Ran Chan. Over time, this war was scaled up with the direct involvement of the U.S. Army and the Saigon administration.
In
1970, I served in Air Squadron 221 when U.S. advisor directed us to conduct special work. We flew to designated coordinates, tied the rope from the floor of our helicopter onto the cardboard barrels and kicked them out onto the ground. I threw out 3 barrels altogether. Outside each barrel there was a code and the label "Danger" with skull and crossbones. The chemical warfare the U.S. conducted in Vietnam lasted 10 years, the longest recorded sustained usage of chemical weapons. During this period of time, the U.S. forces sprayed more than 80 million liters of toxic chemicals, mainly Agent Orange Dioxin, on southern Vietnam. These missions were aimed at clearing ground near U.S. bases and those forests along the main Vietnamese supply arteries, destroying crops and annihilating life, thus forcing people to live in U.S. control zones.
Quân đội Mỹ đã sử dụng thành tựu khoa học hiện đại của khoa học trong nông nghiệp.
The U.S. Army had used the achievements of modern agrochemistry, including pesticides, herbicides, and hormone-stimulating growth of plants for military purposes. They applied a dose of 20, 30, or even more times higher than permitted, which seriously impacted and damaged people's health. According to the world scientists, the concentration of dioxin in substance 2,4,5-T, namely in Agent Orange, is 3 ppm. Some say it must be 13 ppm or more. Based on this data, many scientists believe the U.S. troops have scattered 366 kilograms of dioxin across Vietnam's south. Others say this figure might reach 500 or even 2,000 kilograms. Earlier, the toxic chemical dioxin was thought to be an impurity in the substance 2,4,5-T, but in fact it wasn't. In 1977, 4 years before the U.S. Army sprayed this chemical in southern Vietnam, an American and a German scientist had succeeded in synthesizing dioxin. Perhaps dioxin had been a chemical inserted product at that time, not simply an impurity. U.S. troops sprayed toxic chemicals not only on designated front lines in southern Vietnam, but also in vast areas, forests, mountains, fields, and villages. Different means were used for the spray. As a consequence, more than 3 million hectares of forests were destroyed, causing a severe imbalance in ecosystems and directly affecting the habitat of a large number of people. This is the area at the Da Nang airport, which used to warehouse Agent Orange dioxin. 30 years after the war, this toxin still exists with an unacceptably high residue content. The Ashore airport in Thừa Thiên Huế was sprayed with Agent Orange at a density of 70 gallons per square kilometers during wartime. Now, nearly 40 years later, this area is still severely polluted by the dioxin residue in the ground, much higher than permitted levels. Some lawyers from the United States have witnessed with their own eyes how life had been ravaged in this land. The environment in many places throughout Vietnam has been seriously affected by Agent Orange dioxin. That truth has been proven, and so have the terrible consequences it left on humans. Trần Văn Trâm and Trần Thị Dần in Quảng Trị province, a locality exposed to Agent Orange during the American War, have 7 children, 4 of whom have cerebral palsy. Their family has lived in misery for scores of years. Victims Lê Văn Khanh and Lê Thị Đèo, also in Quảng Trị, were born with disabilities as a consequence of their exposure to Agent Orange dioxin. The two brothers, Nguyễn Sơn Linh and Nguyễn Sơn Trung in Thừa Thiên Huế, have suffered paralysis in both legs since they were kids. Their father, Nguyễn Hải Sơn, used to live and work in an area sprayed with Agent Orange in wartime. Nguyễn Văn Lanh and Nguyễn Văn Trường are the two patients of cerebral palsy. Their mother, Lê Thị Mít, has surrendered to destinies for years, accepting a fact that their disease is incurable. The 22-year-old Trần Văn Hoàn in Thái Bình province has had ulcers all over his body since he was 3 months old. Nguyễn Văn Quý in Hải Phòng City, a war veteran from a southern battlefield, is a patient of stomach cancer. His 2 children suffer birth defects caused by Agent Orange.
Dioxin gây ra rất nhiều bệnh. Nó là một chất rất độc. Nghiên cứu ở Việt Nam.
Dioxin is the cause of a lot of diseases. It's extremely toxic. Our research conducted independently in the military hospital 108 in Vietnam and that done with the National Institute of Medical Research of France has shown a clear link between exposure to Agent Orange dioxin with digestive diseases and stomach and liver cancers. We've studied Nguyễn Văn Quý medical file very carefully and found he'd been exposed to Agent Orange many times. After intensive tests, we've diagnosed he suffered stomach cancer and is now spread to his liver. Đoàn Minh Yến in Huế City is a patient of lung cancer. Nguyễn Ngọc Siết suffered the same fatal disease. On the screen is the image of Hồ Xuân Bắc when he was still alive. 4 months after, when a group of American lawyers visited his family for evidence gathering, Buck had died of lung cancer.
Maybe a little disturbance in her life, but she will have her Vietnamese attorneys here.
Another victim also infected with lung cancer is Lê Thị Vịnh, whose health quickly degraded after a surgery and a chemical therapy. Vịnh is now living on borrowed time, which is counted only by months or weeks. Nguyễn Công Trinh has caught blood cancer, or more precisely, malignant lymphoma. Võ Xuân Hải, a teacher in Thừa Thiên Huế, suffers malignant lymphoma of the lymph nodes in his neck. And this is Võ Thanh Hải and his father. They are patients of bone cancer and a rare cancer among head and neck cancers. Both are now taking chemical therapy. Suffering different diseases, they all have one thing in common. They are victims of Agent Orange dioxin sprayed by the U.S. Army in southern Vietnam during the war. This is Mai Kim, a little patient from Bình Thuận province. He was born with deformities in his lower jaw bones, his thigh bones and his marrow vertebra, a typical disease caused by Agent Orange. Mai Kim is one of the 3 cases missing vertebrae at birth that have been detected by Vietnamese doctors so far.
Tôi đã phát hiện được 3 trường hợp spina bifida như thế này, tức là hở cột sống bẩm sinh.
I've detected 3 cases missing vertebrae at birth. American scientists have classified this rare disease as a consequence of Agent Orange. This patient is Mai Kim. He has defects in his vertebrae, thigh bones, lower jaw bones, and respiratory tracts. His spinal column has vertebrae uncovered at the back. This photo is about another patient. She's yet to take any surgery. A big tumor is growing out of her marrow. When she was standing to have this photo taken with me, she released her urine and fecal liquid uncontrollably. This X-ray film shows all her vertebrae extruded as they have no rear caps or lids.
Đây là cái phim cột sống của nó, hở toàn bộ 10 mấy đốt sống, không có cái cung sau, tức là không có cái nắp ở đằng sau. Hay cái cháu Thắng này cũng thế.
The third patient is Thang. He also has congenital deformities in his spinal column, with vertebrae having slots in between. Though not fatal, this disease cripples its victims, tortures them with disorders in their excretory system, and absolutely destroys their ability to work.
Và nhất là hoàn toàn bệnh nhân không còn có khả năng lao động gì nữa.
These are not the only disasters caused by Agent Orange. After the war, many Vietnamese veterans and people in Agent Orange affected regions have given birth to children like this. So although the war is over, it's still delivering pain and destroying the lives of millions of families of Agent Orange victims in Vietnam, both physically and spiritually. Nguyễn Văn Cát, a resident near Ashore Airport, has a son named Nguyễn Văn Hoàng. 12 years after his birth, Hoàng can neither speak nor walk yet. And these are the dead fetuses now preserved at the Obstetric Hospital in Ho Chi Minh City. Right at their birth, they have been deprived of their most basic right, the right to live a normal life as humans. the maintenance of our form of the human race has been damaged.
Các cái nhà khoa học từ 22 nước, trong đó có cả
Scientists from 22 countries, including those from the United States, France, Germany, Japan and the Netherlands have been here many times.
Ở Việt Nam có mấy cái dị tật bẩm sinh mà
They say the deformities they've seen are exclusive to Vietnam, namely those in nervous ducts like the absence of a skull, Siamese twins or defects on facial structure, short or abnormal limbs, hair lips, bifida in the throat.
Cái thứ ba là cái khuyết tật về các cái giác quan ở trên mặt.
We've worked on these diseases right here in Từ Dũ Hospital and with our colleagues at home and abroad.
Và cái thứ năm là cái sức môi và chẻ vùng hầu. Thì đó là những cái vấn đề mà chúng tôi đã nghiên cứu ở đây tại bệnh viện Từ Dũ.
We've made various presentations at international conferences and got a lot of sympathy.
Quốc tế ở nước ngoài.
Our reports have been printed in the Chemisphere newspaper in Britain and a publication by the US Public Health Society.
Và trong cái báo của cái hội về y tế cộng đồng ở Hoa Kỳ.
Over 30 years have passed since the US was forced to stop spraying Agent Orange. This toxic chemical is still ravaging people's health. The sorrow of Vietnamese Agent Orange dioxin victims and families suffering seems to have no limit. Trần Minh Thảo in Thái Bình province is a case in point. And this is Nguyễn Thị Nhu in Tây Đô Commune, Hưng Hà District, Thái Bình province. For nearly 20 years now, this woman alone has had to care for her husband and 3 children infected with terrible disease triggered by contact with Agent Orange dioxin. No word can describe enough of the pains and torment, both physically and spiritually, she has been suffering.
I work in the field all day and don't return home until 9 or 10 p.m. I get up at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning to make things ready for my next day's work. My kids can't help me as they know nothing. In other families, parents and children stay happily with each other in the evening. That doesn't take place in our family. I wish I had time to bathe and care for my kids. When they were younger, sometimes I had to put a wash tub onto the bed to wash their arms and legs because they couldn't do it themselves. There were several times in the winter when I got home and found them making a mess all over the house with the leftovers. In daytime, they can't help but be swarmed by flies and ants, and at night they climb onto 2 separate beds to sleep. When they see me home, smeared all over with soil and mud, they just raise their heads and then lie down again without saying a word. To bathe my kids, sometimes I have to pretend to buy them new hats or clothes, or they won't let me touch them. They've bitten me black and blue many times, and even bitten me till I bled.
Because of the unusually harsh consequences of contact with dioxins on the human system limited to Vietnam, there is as yet no documentation that could possibly predict an end to the effects on generation of families. Too desperate with the illness of their daughter, Mr. and Mrs. Trần Văn Nguyên in Thái Bình province have fled home, leaving the 4-year-old Trần Thị Khánh Linh with her paternal grandfather. Born in 1993, Nguyễn Khả Tuyến has sat on this wheelchair for 10 years now. Tuyến is one of the more than 300,000 children in Vietnam suffering disabilities as a consequence of Agent Orange dioxin. He is the third generation in Nguyễn Khả Diễn family affected by this toxic chemical. Vietnamese people have returned to peacetime with their own plans for the future. However, not everyone can realize those plans. Agent Orange dioxin deprives many Vietnamese women of their right to be mothers. Buddhist nun Khieu Thị Mừng is one such victim. The dangerous disease Agent Orange dioxin gave her has forced her to take the veil, isolating herself from the life of a normal woman.
Since I became ill at the age of 20, my health has seriously degraded. The monks and nuns in this pagoda are very nice to me. I thought life is suitable for me, so I've decided to spend the rest of my life in the pagoda.
Đối với tôi sức khỏe nó phù hợp cho nên là tôi chọn con đường tôi về ăn mày nương tựa phóng Phật.
On the 25th of August 1969, President Ho Chi Minh sent a letter to U.S. President Richard Nixon, accusing the U.S. forces of using toxic chemicals during their war in Vietnam. The U.S. claimed they employed the herbicide for ground clearance. At the Oxford Conference held in Paris in 1970, Vietnamese Professor Tôn Thất Tùng told the war scientists that cancers, miscarriages, birth defects, and degenerates found in many Vietnamese families were caused by Agent Orange dioxin. The U.S. considered his presentation strictly propaganda. "26 years later, in July of 1996, U.S. President Bill Clinton announced that additional illnesses had been determined by the National Academy of Sciences linked to the use of Agent Orange, and that compensations would therefore be paid to the affected veterans and their children. Preliminary statistics show that of the 3 million U.S. soldiers and officers warring in Vietnam, more than 200,000 have been affected by unusual diseases consistent with toxic chemicals such as dioxin. In Vietnam, at least 3 million people have been victimized by Agent Orange dioxin. Many have been inflicted with incurable diseases. In many families, both the father and mother and their children are all victims of Agent Orange dioxin. Many of them have died. Many others have their second or even their third generation born with congenital defects. Agent Orange victims are often women, and the elderly. Many have given birth to 2 or even 3 children with deformities, who now have died one after another. These victims of Agent Orange have specific right to make a claim against U.S. chemical firms who profited from Agent Orange production for the war in Vietnam and said firms must take responsibility for their legal and moral liability for the deep suffering they have caused.
What he say is he asked all of us to help him, and his fellow in the same condition like him to get some compensation for his condition, and he asked the American people to help him, to give him justice in his case.
Đưa lên bản cân cho nó, tôi cũng được cái quyền như thế là cái công lý, được cái lẽ phải.
Trong những cái hoàn cảnh như gia đình nhà chúng tôi đây thì thật
Our family is now living in misery.
chỉ mong làm sao
We want those who had caused this disaster to be held responsible.
tai nạn này thì có trách nhiệm với chúng tôi một phần.
Vietnam has millions of people affected by Agent Orange, and no one can count how many more will become its victims, as it's still wreaking havoc on the next generations. I demand the U.S. chemical group be held accountable for these victims and their families, both the living and the dead. Vietnam has now collected 7 million signatures demanding justice be done for Agent Orange dioxin victims, which is a righteous petition not only for the victims themselves, but also for the whole community of Vietnamese nationals. For years now, despite post-war financial difficulties, the Vietnamese government has spent massive amounts of money on overcoming the consequences Agent Orange had triggered for the environment. A national committee has been set up to investigate the aftermath of the chemical warfare. Research and caregiving centers have been established for the Agent Orange dioxin victims. The Vietnamese government has financed orthopedic surgeries for children with disabilities and given regular allowances for Agent Orange victims and their children with birth defects. Individuals and organizations from different countries around the world have voiced their support and assisted Agent Orange dioxin victims in Vietnam. Among them are the Red Cross societies of Norway, Germany, the United States, Denmark, Sweden, Spain, and the Ford Foundation. On the 1st of October 2004, Secretary of the Britain-Vietnam Friendship Society landholders sent a letter to U.S. President George W. Bush calling on the U.S. government to take responsibility towards Agent Orange victims in Vietnam. The letter reads, "On behalf of all those who have endorsed the petition, I implore you to accept the United States responsibility for the Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange. However, up to now, the U.S. chemical firms are still trying to evade their responsibility." The Declaration of Independence of the United States in 1776 formally declares that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration put the right to life first, which is perfectly true. When the right to life is deprived, it'd be nonsense and immoral to mention other rights. The Agent Orange the U.S. forces use in Vietnam has violated the human right to life. This right includes living in joy and health, to live in comfort and happiness, and to live as long as your faith allows. The Agent Orange the U.S. forces used in Vietnam has stolen fatherhood from millions of Vietnamese men and stolen from motherhood from millions of women. It's also made tens of thousands of children born as creatures unable to speak, to smile, and to have feelings during their short lives. Therefore, the Agent Orange the U.S. forces used in Vietnam must be considered a weapon of mass destruction. Vietnamese and American lawyers have gathered sufficient evidence proving that the US chemical firms produce Agent Orange for huge profits and hidden its destructive properties. They had known very well how this toxin could do hurt the right to life of Vietnamese people. So it'd be nonsense if we claim human rights protection for Agent Orange victims in Vietnam without demanding the US chemical firms compensate for them. The victims are suffering unspeakable horrors, pain and sorrow, and their lives are feared to be very short. Try to ask the US chemical firms to pay damages to them. It's fair, and it's the justice for which progressive courts around the world, including the courts in America, are dedicated to. Nearly 30 years after the war, in the atmosphere of peace and happiness, tens of millions of Vietnamese children go to school every day, like their peers in other parts of the world. A bright future is opening before them. But at the same time, those children who are among millions of victims of Agent Orange in Vietnam endure pain and suffering. They cannot walk. They cannot speak. They cannot have their own children and were robbed of their own childhood. And they are creatures that cannot grow to become humans. Why? Only those US chemical firms involved can answer this question.